Hello and welcome along to today's webinar. We've got a really fascinating topic which is on social media and its effects on mental health and well-being with Shaaba. But before I hand you over and we start the webinar formally, I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you all for joining us and run through a little bit more about the centre and what we provide. So as you may be aware, we are funded by the ESRC Business. We are the ESRC Business and Local Government Data Research Centre. We offer a range of services, including grant-funded research projects and data analytics, bespoke training on data analytics, as well as consultations on how you can optimise your data for real impact. We also offer a range of webinars, including this one, conferences, showcases, and newsletters. So please feel free to follow us on social media in order to avoid missing out. Our data analytics innovation vouchers allow you to access expertise from renowned academics from across the UK to undertake grant-funded research aligned to your objectives. Together, we explore data, enhance knowledge, and empower society. So that was just a quick overview of what we can provide, but I didn't want to use up too much time today because I really wanted to spend our webinar focused on how social media really can affect mental health and well-being. So with that, I'd like to introduce Shaaba. Shaaba, I don't know if you want to start by telling us a little bit about you, your background and your studies.
Sure, of course. Thanks very much for having me on, Laura. So my name's Shaaba. I am in the first year of my PhD at the minute. This is also my first time studying psychology. My background beforehand are in the fields of law and also management and marketing, but marketing in this field, so it's not too much of a jump away. Personally as well, my interests do tie in quite heavily with what I'm researching at the moment. My partner Jamie and I have been creators on the YouTube platform for a number of years now.
And so which platforms do you tend to use the most?
Primarily our personal presence is on the YouTube platform. However, I feel like social media these days is definitely an omnipresent thing. So we do have accounts and presence on the main platforms. The other notable ones, I guess, are Instagram and Twitter primarily.
I think that's what makes this conversation and your insights so valuable. It's that you really practice what you preach. I mean, you started off as a video blogger. You are a social media influencer, if you don't mind me saying, and now it's really led into this professional area of research, which I feel is something that's going to be of real interest to our audience today.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's also really useful for choosing a research topic. It seemed the obvious choice because it's obviously something that I'm quite passionate about and really interested in. So I'm pretty sure I won't get bored of this after multiple years of research.
So your research is really delving into how social media impacts mental health and well-being. And I wonder if you could tell us from the early indications from your research so far, what are you finding? How is social media impacting us emotionally and physically?
I think it's really interesting. Everyone knows that there is an influence of social media, and quite often when it's discussed in relation to well-being and aspects of mental health, particularly in relation to younger people, there's a lot of negativity shown. Screen time is a huge buzzword at the moment. The ability to limit what people are saying, or I guess negative expressions that can influence people in the wrong way is also something that's spoken about a lot. And there's been huge and very useful work being done on that. But what I'm trying to look into at this point is how we can harness different relationships that are actually created on social media, how they fit within their lives, and how we can use those relationships to incite positive change, whether that be through disseminating really meaningful information through channels that people are obviously listening to. If you ask a young person who their role models are in these days, I'm sure you will still have traditional media celebrities, but I would be very surprised if someone didn't mention a social media creator that they also followed quite avidly. But also in terms of just having that one-on-one connection with someone, there's so much relationship research that shows that the connections in our lives can really positively impact our well-being and our mental health. And I'm sure that creators also have a very similar effect. So that's really what I'm trying to explore.
When you're comparing those different relationship types, have you seen any benefits we get from ordinary social relationships in comparison to these online relationships, which were perceived, I suppose, as being slightly more one-sided on some of the platforms, although I do feel that that is changing because you can obviously engage with the creator in the comments section through
Yeah,
live Q&As.
of
So
course.
also
Yeah.
I would be very interested in knowing your research so far and the findings in the data analytics around comparing the relationship types.
Sure. So my research and my wonderful team helped me create a survey which we took to VidCon earlier on this year. We received multiple hundreds of responses from participants who typically watch YouTube and various other video platforms. It's why they were there at the event. And they did report on, we asked them to report on three main types of ties. So based on a paper by Sandstrom and Dunn, which was done in 2014, they explored the effects of strong ties versus weak ties. So just to provide some definitions, a strong tie is someone who has a substantial influence on our lives, who we speak to on a regular basis. So examples of these would typically be spouses or partners or best friends, immediate family members, that sort of thing. And the alternative to that would be weak ties. So these are people who we have less intimate contact with and see less often. And typical examples of a weak tie would be, for example, an acquaintance or a neighbour, or perhaps the barista that serves you your coffee every morning, who we don't really disclose too much to. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense.
So we asked people to nominate their strong ties, weak ties, and also the creators they watch, and through a variety of scales, essentially value which needs these specific people in their lives fulfill. And based on the preliminary analysis, we've got some really interesting results. On all fronts, creators were seen as just as there was no main difference between creators and their strong ties, suggesting that there was nothing of significance that separated the two. However, both strong ties and creators were considered significantly more valuable for fulfilling these needs than weak ties.
And why do you think that is?
Um, I, I I personally find it really interesting that strong ties and creators for the need fulfillment section of this were quite the same. But I think what that shows is people are having such connections with the creators that they, these are people that they'll be watching and who are disclosing really vulnerable information in quite a lot of scenarios about their own personal lives, about their mental health. They're letting loads of people into their own lives to follow on their journey. And I personally think my opinion would be that forms a connection. It's almost like you've got a friend. It's just someone you can't perhaps reach out and touch, but you can still connect with on a very regular basis. So they're serving or seem to be serving the similar needs to their strong ties.
And when you were comparing these ties, did it look at any particular social media platform? Was it Instagram? Was it YouTube?
We have
Um,
Sure. We've specifically looked only at YouTube creators on this front, and that's something that I was quite keen on looking at right now because of the differences in the platforms and the different effects on mental health that all of them seem to have from previous research.
I wonder if that's an opportunity for us to just touch on just for our audience, the different forms of social media. I wonder if you could run through what they are and perhaps the demographics that use them. And I think you've got a nice slide on that.
Yeah, of
Um,
course. Would you mind navigating there for me?
No problem at all. Is this the slide that you wanted?
This is a really interesting slide that I'll probably touch base on as well, if that's okay, Laura. So,
Absolutely.
the Royal Society for Public Health, who are an incredible organisation that do a lot of work surrounding different aspects of mental health and public health, they've created an APPG, which is an all-party parliamentary group, where they're working with policymakers at the moment on effects of young people and social media. So this research was something that they did in 2017, and they actually assessed the, I guess, overall effects that this have on young people across the 5 main platforms. Laura, if you don't mind going back one slide. Thank you very much. So from here, what we can see is on their overall graph of the 5 main platforms, which I'll quickly run through now. So Snapchat has come in 4th place, and on the left-hand side is a very sort of temporal platform. It works a lot on photos and text being shown for 30 seconds to close connections that you've allowed onto your network, and then they'll just disappear. Twitter there is second on that platform. And it's very text led, so I'm pretty sure everyone knows what Twitter is. Short characters, text, sometimes pictures of current affairs. YouTube has come out on first there on that podia, and that's a very video based platform. Facebook, which is showing as third there, is mostly used for more local communities and personal connections, but it's still used a lot for the dissemination of quite a lot of media, texts, photos, and also video. And Instagram there, which is fifth on the little podia down on the right hand side, is a very picture based platform. So what this shows is really interesting. From the RSPH research, you can see that the only platform of those 5 to have a net positive impact on its users who were young people is YouTube. The other 4 did have a net negative impact. And as you can see there, YouTube is leaps and bounds ahead of Instagram, which is significantly lower on that podium.
And do you think it is because YouTube offers a much more raw and multimedia, I suppose? You've got the audio and the visual
Yeah,
contact, I suppose, with creators. Do you think there is just a correlation there, or do you think it's a causation with the net positive and net negative?
that's definitely something that we hypothesize, that it is because of the multimedia form. We talk about editing a lot and presenting a very authentic image of oneself, and I don't know. This is just coming from my personal experience, as I said, and anecdotal stuff that we've experienced. Instagram does seem far more superficial in that sense. It's one picture. Everyone has Facetune now on their phones. They can edit it. They can basically make yourself look like someone you're not, and almost erase all of your flaws, which can be a really negative thing to be putting out to younger people, especially when we're talking about what creating goals for them to aspire to and whether they're actually attainable. YouTube, on the other hand, it's kind of difficult to edit that in the same way because it's video software. Unless you have a huge amount of expertise and software, you're not really going to be able to edit your flaws out in the same way, or perhaps look as glamorous as people do in magazines and on Instagram. At the same time, though, there's still a type of editing that we need to be wary of on the YouTube platform, and that's in the content that people put out there. Sometimes the almost rose-tinted glasses can come in the form of omitting certain experiences. So people might watch lots of creators and then think, oh, look at this person, they never argue, they never have a down day in their life. So if you're only putting out the positive sides of you, that could be creating unattainable goals in a different way. So these are all things that we look to explore.
I think that's really interesting, and we were talking in a previous conversation, weren't we, Shaaba, around more transparency around product placement and marketing,
Yeah.
and how now the government really does try to put in place policies to encourage creators to be more open with their audience when they have been paid or when there's product placement in any of their platforms. But that policy isn't really in place for showing true life. And I wonder if you could build on that at all, Shaaba.
Most certainly. And if we could just head to the next slide, Laura, I think that's a really great example of it too. So this is from the same report of the status of mind. And what we can see here across the two, specifically on things like FOMO, which is an acronym used for fear of missing out, we can see that for Instagram, it's significantly heavier than for YouTube. There's loads of other things where there's quite a lot of comparison. So if we look on YouTube, the negative effects on body image is significantly less than that on Instagram. The other notable ones for me would be for anxiety to depression and loneliness. YouTube actually have a net positive outcome on these effects, whereas on Instagram they do have a negative outcome. So I think this is just a really good superficial, high-level insight, if you like, on the differences of what the platforms are providing for different people. And the FOMO one in particular is something that I'd want to draw attention to for that exact point. With things like product placements, it's very clear that people have a huge influence on these platforms, and people want to be like these creators. They want to use what they're using, have what they're having, experiencing what they're experiencing, and that fear of missing out is a huge indication of that.
I really find it interesting as well around the community building aspect. Both of them have scored positively
Yeah.
for that particular marker, with YouTube obviously being a fraction higher.
Sure.
And we know that social media can reduce isolation and loneliness for people that perhaps can't get out and about or aren't able to connect physically with people who share their interests. Does your research pick up at all on that community building aspect of YouTube with its creators, but also with fellow followers of creators?
Ooh. Yeah, and that's actually a really interesting point that you mentioned about loneliness. I think people who, if you think about the typical person who uses social media, perhaps as a follower creator, an avid fan of creators, what you would expect is someone who perhaps very stereotypically doesn't have many friends, who only relies on this, and it really feeds into this whole media narrative of, oh no, phones are taking away our social lives. You know, children are only wanting to connect with people online, and they're missing out what's right in front of them. Interestingly, from the research that we carried out on looking at the individual differences and the status of participants, they weren't in particular more lonely. They weren't really low on loneliness. They weren't really low on things like depression or anxiety. They're all, for the most part, overall normal people. So social media does seem to be influencing something, influencing the wider society, regardless of whether you have friends. And previous research does also show this. It's not something that intends to completely replace the social networks that we have with real people in our lives who we see offline. It's just a way to perhaps enhance these benefits, especially for people who might have interaction anxiety that means they can't reap the benefits from their actual connections in real life. I hope that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And I think that as social media becomes more and more prominent in everyday life across a range of ages and backgrounds, it can be used as a power for good or for bad. And I think that bad often is picked up on in the media, particularly around trolling and online bullying.
So,
Have you looked into that aspect at all?
we've not looked into that aspect at the minute, but it's definitely something that we would like to look into. So there's almost like a triangle of relationships, from creators to viewers, but also viewers to other viewers. So whilst sometimes there can certainly be negative aspects of people putting other people down online, not just for being certain creators, but also for viewers of watching certain people. There's also, what we've noticed anecdotally, a huge uplift and sense of community happening in those comments boxes underneath. By being able to talk about certain issues, people come out and share their own experiences, and other people support and encourage that, and sometimes console and give their own advice. So it can be a great way to really get communities together.
Do you have any examples of
Um,
perhaps how people are coming together to support one another? Any particular topics that stand out?
Sure. So, just from personal experience, we've seen so much of this happen within the LGBT community. But I think I actually have a slide of something here. If we can forward on to the iWay ones, which I can just quickly touch base on. So iWay was something set up by Jamila Jamil, who's a public face for other media ventures that she's been working on. And she started this concept of iWay as a different way to value who we are and what our wealth is, except for what we see on the scales. So body image is a huge issue in the media these days, as we were just talking about the whole idea of unattainable goals. So now everyone can post in, and she'll publicly share on this platform people who feel their worth is measured in so many different ways. So as you can see here, the person on the left is measuring themselves as friends and the connections that they have with other people, their qualities like being compassionate and a hard worker, and a mentor. And it's fantastic to see people recognize and value these different parts of themselves, and celebrate that. And every single post that you see has a huge flurry of likes and comments from other people saying, "Oh my gosh, that's really cool." So yeah, I think that's a great example of how communities can build together and help each other build on support instead of tearing each other down.
And is this on Instagram, or is this as a multi-platform?
It's multi-platform, but it is primarily on Instagram at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I took this photo.
No, I think it's a really nice example. So I just wanted to bring the conversation now onto a different demographic, I suppose, of social media users, and that is the rise of the silver surfer, if you like, those older social media users, and how they're becoming increasingly digitally savvy. Has your work picked up on that, and what do you see for the future, and how organisations, perhaps the NHS or the councils, can really optimize those relationships that are starting to build?
Yeah, so the older generation is not something that my research is particularly looking at the moment. As you very nicely put it, the Silver Surfers, I think that's a great name. However, there's lots of work that's been done on new technologies in general and the Silver Surfers, and I think it's really important to recognize, which is something that the Financial Times actually did a really great article on recently, but at the moment, the stigma behind the older generation using technology will quickly go away. Our current silver surfers have never grown up with technology to hand, but in a few generations' time, that won't be the case, and there'll be an exponentially increasing need to be able to provide these services to people who have grown up with technology and know exactly what to do with it. But at the moment, what we're seeing is Silver Surfers definitely use the local community aspects of social media a lot more. So, for example, community pages, things like forums. I think you've got a wonderful slide there, Laura, from My Home Life. So that's a great organisation with the Fans Network, which, just as an example, they use this to share resources, to share meetups, to share experiences, and to just help each other out in a different way.
And I suppose that's happening more and more now, that the social media platforms and the physical platforms for making connections are merging. So you mentioned meetups.
Yeah.
And I've seen these internationally now, with communities coming together that are perhaps met online and are having meetups for shared interests.
It's fantastic, isn't it? Like, I think it's a great thing. And I know this digresses a little bit from social media a little bit, but a huge example of this, of how this was wholly successful, was the whole Pokemon Go phase. For those who may not know, Pokemon Go is a little sort of VR game on your phone, and avid Pokemon fans were meeting up in different places to go and do this together on social media. Although it sounds paradoxical in the sense that people are still on their phones but within the same vicinity, there are huge examples of how social media has brought these groups together. VidCon, as I mentioned earlier, is another example of people sharing these interests and coming together. And sometimes it's not just for interest-based things. There are huge campaigns for charity. For example, YouTube creators are often called upon to help promote the Stand Up to Cancer campaign, and huge amounts of money have been raised through these interests that have been people making friends and uniting either over one cause, but also sometimes over one person.
Mm. And as well as the cancer, there is obviously the mental health, the campaigns that come out around mental health. So it really spans across both physical and mental health to encompass the whole of the person and the whole of the well-being.
Yeah, and I think the great thing about introducing social media creators in this way is that they're almost different to the traditional celebrities by being that much more relatable. You know, all social media creators often still have the presence and the vibe of someone who has just been exactly like you, who's decided to pick up a camera and share their story with the world. There's not huge amounts of production or editing. There's often not huge amounts of security, at least not in those first stages. So that relatability really helps form those connections with creators in this way, which I think is instrumental for being able to carry through a powerful message. And I think it's something that a lot of charities sort of miss out on as a source of being able to disseminate meaningful information and campaigns.
I think that that's really true, and the charity and the public sector are slightly more behind, I suppose, with optimizing these engagement platforms, the social media aspect, than the commercial sector.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's because of lack of resource, but what through your work, have you had much contact so far with perhaps the public sector and the parliament? You mentioned it being involved in a parliamentary group.
Yeah, so this is definitely something that I'm wanting to progress with the Royal Society for Public Health and the APPG that they've very kindly involved me in. The idea of being able to use creators as this resource is so important and hugely underused in the public sector. As you mentioned, though, resource is a big deal, and I mean, everything is capitalized and commercialized at the moment. Social media is certainly not an exception. The value of creators are quite high, and to be able to use them to promote services can be expensive. But I think because perhaps there's less awareness of the input that they can bring and the meaningfulness behind the influence that they have, the public sector just don't really take it seriously. I want to say this is all based on anecdotal things, of course, but perhaps being able to write in policy to use that, or also just to show how many creators are also willing to help out when causes matter, is definitely something that I'd like to be more well known.
So far in your research, have you got any leading stakeholders involved and interested in order to really bring the end results of your research into mainstream and really inform policy?
Yeah, so working with the Royal Society for Public Health has definitely been the main contact for there. We've talked about joint reports, we've talked about doing conferences, even to non-academic audiences, so business people, charitable campaign leaders, pro-social campaign leaders, on all matters of this, and even getting creators together to form panels. I've got a wonderful group of about 20 creators who have all volunteered their time to help out specifically with this project and share this information. So hopefully there'll be multiple pathways to impact where we can make substantial change, especially with their involvement with the APPG.
As a renowned blogger and online creator, I feel that you're always at the forefront of these trends. So I'd be
Yeah.
really interested to know, how do you see the future of social media panning out?
I think research suggests this too, but that combined with my personal opinion, the social media is not going to go anywhere. The platforms that we have currently on top, the 5 that you're seeing on the slides right now, as you can see, have such a huge reach, and this is just increasing every single day. And we've seen the rise and fall of certain platforms, and to carry on a very cheesy metaphor, in the ashes of those, new ones have just risen to replicate them. So perhaps in 10 years' time, we may not see the exact same platforms there, but I do think they'll still have a huge presence.
Do you feel these platforms need to have more governance around them now that they are becoming increasingly important in our lives?
Most certainly, and that's definitely something that the all-party parliamentary group are definitely working towards. I feel like it's almost come as quite of a shock to people with the rise in technology. It's crazy to think how quickly even things like the internet have, developed from what they were not that many years ago to what they are now. iPhones, social media, it's mind-boggling, and I think policy has had a really tricky time catching up with this exponential increasing curve of what social media has now become. But I definitely think, especially with the introductions of live streams that have happened recently, there are huge amounts of content that anyone has access to. Unlike traditional media, there's not huge gatekeepers and key holders. Anyone can pick up a camera, anyone can pick up a mobile device and start broadcasting anything. And we have seen in very, very recent affairs hugely detrimental examples of how that can go wrong. So policy definitely needs to be built around it. And I do think people are working on it. It's just because it's such a fluid, flexible, and ever growing thing, it's quite a difficult thing to try and tie down and pop into a document, if you know what I mean.
And I suppose some of that obviously needs to come around governance from the top, but it also needs to filter from the bottom, perhaps around education in schools. Just as
Yeah,
we are educated on what is appropriate behaviour, we need to be educated on what's appropriate behaviour for social media,
and
how to
most
behave
certainly.
safely, and also the impact that can have on your followers.
And a lot has been spoken about screen time and limiting school children, for example, being the prime example, from using devices in school hours at school buildings. But I think it's really important that we recognize the need to, as you say, properly educate people on how to use social media in an authentic and uh, safe and sensible way. Just telling people not to use it here, or you shouldn't use it, and popping it to one side is not going to help, because as a force that's not going anywhere, it's just a bad idea to shut people down. Having more open and exposed conversations about it is definitely the way forward.
I think as well those conversations need to focus not only on the negatives but the potential positives, how that these individuals at any time of their life could use it to build new relationships,
Most certainly.
and reduce the loneliness that can be quite prevalent in the UK at the moment.
I definitely agree. And if we go back to our lovely Silver Surfers, that's a great way. If there are things like inhibited mobility, or just a lack of people around, using social media in that way, if people are willing to embrace these new technologies, is a great way to keep reaping those benefits of the social interactions around us without perhaps having to venture outside if it's not possible or impractical for some people to do.
So what hopes do you have for your research in the future, and what are the next steps? You're partway through, am I correct in thinking of,
Yeah.
so you've got the initial findings from your research?
Yeah, so this is the first study that we've done, and this question's really about understanding the roles that parasocial relationships formed on between creators and viewers have in our lives, and the needs that they fulfill. The next steps that we'll be looking into, after looking into this a little bit further, is how that can affect different communities. So one of the really sad uh, analyses that we found from our VidCon data was the amount of LGBT participants on all fronts of individual differences were significantly less better off. So, for example, our LGBT participants had significantly less self esteem, significantly more loneliness and anxiety and depression. And I think it really shows there, coupled with the fact that our preliminary analyses on the difference between LGBT and non-LGBT participants, the LGBT participants seemed to value the relationships of strong ties and YouTubers to be far more similar than non-LGBT people, which was a very wordy way of basically saying that with their lower self-esteem, mental health, and well-being, I think there's a greater chance there that needs to be explored on how creators can really be a meaningful source of support in their lives. So exploring that will be our next step, certainly. Following that, we'd also like to look into the different factors that can strengthen this and carry out some experimental studies that show how we can really harness these relationships that are clearly established between creators and viewers to incite pro-social behaviour and disseminate positive social messages. Hopefully then the public sector in particular will better understand the value that these relationships can have on influencing society in a positive way.
Do you hope that the resulting report from your studies could be used as a best practice guide to help particularly influential online creators as almost as part of their informal training, I like to say, to help them understand the impact that they are having on their followers?
Most certainly, and I've had current discussions, although nothing's confirmed yet. We are in discussion with YouTube LLC themselves, who have expressed an interest in using these findings to create actual creator training. So giving these to creators to say, hey, just in case you weren't aware, your influence goes beyond advertising products and services from commercial companies. Like, you have a huge influence on your mental health and well-being, and this is how in particular you can increase this, and this is how it can be used for inciting positive change. So I think there's some great pathways to impact there too.
And so you mentioned around the online creators, the platforms themselves, as well as perhaps the local government. Who else do you think could make use of these findings when you're translating the data and research into industry?
Sure. As you mentioned, industry leaders, the guys leading this platform, government as well, policymakers, because at the moment, as we said, social media is such a fluid and evolving beast at the moment. The policy needs to run with that. And I think we need to make sure that whilst we're putting boundaries in place to limit the negative power that social media have, we also have to ensure we protect the relationships between creators and viewers and use those in the right and authentic way. So I think policymakers have a huge role to play there. Creators themselves as well, as we've obviously said in the training too. But I would, as I've already mentioned, like really love to target that public sector and find a way to show them the value that creators have in showing in disseminating this information. I guess one example that's really come to mind recently is cervical screening. So the NHS has had a huge rebranding on what were previously known as smear tests, and we found a record low in women or biological females going out to do these tests, which are very important for our physical health. And it's just a prime opportunity where creators can really be used, because people trust the creators that they watch on a daily basis. They trust you if you are speaking from an authentic and genuine hand, saying, hey, this is my experience. So being able to do that is a great example of how creators can help disseminate public information.
So I'm just going to move on to a question that we like to ask all of our researchers and guests on the webinar. If you had the opportunity to influence policy or the UK, so if you were in a lift with the Prime Minister, or if you were in America with the President, what, based on your research or the research of others, would you tell them or ask them to be changed?
This is such a difficult question. I don't know,
Just
there's
one
so
thing.
much to be changed. Just one thing. Just one thing. At
Well,
the moment,
you're in a lift, so you don't have too long.
okay, all right. I would probably have to say at the moment, it's probably going to sound very left field, but climate change. I think it's one of the most pressing issues to our world right now. And I guess trying to get the message across that although we can ban straws and raise prices on plastic bags, which is fantastic, we really need to be putting the pressure point on businesses to drastically reduce their consumption and waste. So I don't know, maybe true to my research as well, we could perhaps help rope in the help of all the creators in the world to use their platforms to positively incite change in that way too. Who knows?
Well, I'm just going to open it up to our audience now to see if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in, we do have a few already in the pipeline, I just wanted to ask a quick poll to our audience. So first of all, which social media platform do you currently use?
This is
And just,
exciting.
and just while we're waiting to get those results in. Oh, it's collecting the responses now.
Fantastic.
And okay, we've got 79% of people use Facebook. In second place, 71% use Instagram, 64% use YouTube, 50% use LinkedIn, and 0% use no social media platform at all.
That's really interesting. Well, I say it's really interesting. Of course, the wonderful attendees will be here because of social media. So perhaps it's not unsurprising to see that no one uses social media. But I just think it's testament to how crazy the impact is in our lives. I don't think it's something that's optional anymore. It's something that we need to do, especially as business people trying to spread our messages.
Absolutely. All right, well, I'm going to ask the second question now, just while we're collecting a few more questions for the day. Do you feel that social media is positive or negative on our health?
Oh, this is so interesting, Laura.
So we're collecting the responses now. Okay. It's changing. It's changing quite quickly. You've still got a few seconds to share your views. Whilst we're collecting that information, I'm just going to ask one of the questions which we've had
Brilliant.
from a viewer.
Yeah.
It says, what criteria did you use to define the positivity of those platforms? I think the individual must be referring to the slide previously with the net positive or net negative that you shared.
Oh, sure. There's a huge amount of sort of setup that went into constructing those scales. If you're really interested in that, and I think it's hugely interesting, Laura's created a great handout where you can actually go onto the status of mind report. So this is something that the Royal Society for Public Health did, and they basically ran some focus groups on, I think using semantic coding, they then took from that what was deemed the most important aspects of how social media can help mental health, and that's what constructed those scales. Great question.
Thank you for that question. And does anybody else have any other questions? Just while we're collecting some more. Whilst we're waiting for the rest of the questions to come in, the poll has now closed. Now 53% feel that it's mixed, that it has a mixed impact.
Okay.
7% think it's positive, and 40% feel it's negative.
I'm rather surprised that negative didn't win out on that. I definitely feel like social media does have, and as we've seen, a huge influence and potential to be negative. But what I hope people, the one sort of tidbit that people can take away from today is, whilst there are negative effects that certainly can happen, like everything, there also is a phenomenal potential for social media to have a positive impact, providing it's used in the right way.
I think that's very true. And did we have any more questions from the audience today before we wrap up and close? Okay, we have one more question. So this one is around the financial gains that bloggers can make using social media, and it's do you feel that influences the net positive or net negative gain for each of the platforms? Is it causation or correlation?
That is a great question, and probably requires an hour in itself to properly discuss and explore. I think from personal experience of being on the platform and other people as well, fellow creators who we know quite a lot, Instagram, interestingly, does seem to be where the money really lies in terms of creators. And I think that speaks a lot for the messages that it puts out. There's a real buzz term at the moment called Fitspiration, where people are doing things like shake adverts, fitness adverts, diet adverts, which are huge things, and also fashion and beauty are huge things, which really focus a lot on perhaps encouraging a type of image that maybe needs to not be encouraged as much. And I feel like in that sense, I personally hypothesize that it is more causation than correlation, especially if we look into things like depression, anxiety, and fear of missing out. So, yeah, I hope that answers that aspect of the question in
No,
a high level.
I think it does. Our next question is, what is your opinion on censorship to protect people from the things they might think they don't want to see on social media?
Ooh,
Or
ooh.
shall I repeat the question?
No, I think I've got it. I don't know. I personally am of the opinion that we need to protect freedom of expression. Perhaps working in a university and my experience in that sense has heavily biased that. But I do think we need to be careful about what we censor. Everyone has the right to voice their opinion, and if people are voicing things that are perhaps damaging, it should be used as a great example to create healthy discussion and debate as opposed to just shutting people down.
Mm, I think, again, that goes back to the governance side, doesn't it? It needs to be top down and bottom up.
Most certainly, but I think as well, it's all about harnessing social media, or if social media is going to be used as a carriage to almost carry out those debates and authentic discussions, they do have to be exactly that, authentic and transparent.
Mm. We have a great question here as well. Thank you so much to everyone that's given their questions in. They've been really interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
fantastic.
our next question is, have you any tips for using social media in a way that can have a positive effect on our mental health and well-being?
That's a great question. I think there are two sort of ways to approach this. So, as a creator and as a viewer. So, as a viewer, it's realizing that what you're seeing and interacting with online may not be the full picture. And as a creator on any platform, it's trying to be as authentic and provide as big of a picture as you possibly can. So I think a balance really needs to be struck there. But also, I think people underestimate the power of not just being creators. If there are business owners out there or people who manage business accounts, the ability to start up these discussions on things that matter and that are important within your local community is really powerful and often uh, underrated. That's the word I was looking for.
I think finally, I just wanted to thank you for your time today, Shaba. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. I'm just aware of the time. We've been
That's been
talking
great.
for
Thank
nearly
you.
an hour, and I feel like there is so much more that we could delve into, and it would be great to have you back when the end results of your research have come out, so we can
Thank
talk a
you.
little bit more about your findings. But where can
Sure.
people find out a bit more about you and your work in the meantime?
Sure. So at the moment, you can take a look at my University of Essex researcher profile page. And if you guys have any questions, thank you so much for attending today and letting me speak on this platform. So if you guys have any further questions or would like to see any of the resources that I've mentioned or referenced today, do feel free to drop me an email. I'm sure Laura can add that into a useful link somewhere.
Absolutely. And after today's webinar, we will be posting the audio and the visuals on BLG TV, our YouTube channel. So please feel free to listen again, share it with friends and family, and in the description box below, we will include those useful links and contact details.
Brilliant. And we can pop over there and answer some questions and generate a healthy discussion in the comments section too.
Absolutely, we'll be building the community.
Yeah.
So thanks again, everyone, for listening today on behalf of the ESRC Business and Local Government Data Research Centre. If you'd like to find out more about our work, I urge you to follow us on social media or get in touch to find out more. And with that, I'll say thank you, Shaaba,
Thank
and thank
you.
you, everyone else.
Thank you.